14 years before the first pharaoh wore the double crown, Egyptian scribes were already keeping records. Not of gods, not of creation myths, of payments. The tribute ledgers of the pre-dynastic period are among the least examined documents in Egyptology, not because they are rare, because of what they list as the recipient. Not a temple, not a city-state, not a human king. The recipient is designated by a compound glyph that appears in precisely 4 documents across the entire span of Egyptian writing. Egyptologists have translated it, filed the translation, and moved on. The translation is those above the count, meaning those who exist outside the enumeration of human rulers. Egypt paid tribute to something that was not Egyptian. The records say so plainly. They were carved in stone, copied across dynasties, and then, at a specific moment in Egyptian history that we can date to within a generation, they stopped. No explanation, no declaration. They simply stopped. If suppressed ancient history is what you're after, hit subscribe. Every week we read what institutional Egyptology files and forgets. The Palermo Stone is a 5th dynasty administrative annal, currently fragmented across 3 institutions. The Palermo Regional Archaeological Museum under inventory reference PA 1000, the Cairo Museum under catalog JE 39734, and the Petrie Museum in London under UC 15508. The primary tribute register occupies the 3rd horizontal band of the Palermo fragment, lower right quadrant, column sequence designated PSR3C7 through PSR3C14 in the 1902 Schaeffer Transcription Index. It is not on public display. It has been examined. It has been noted. It has not been explained. Mainstream Egyptology classifies the pre-dynastic registers of the Palermo Stone as mythological preamble. The standard interpretation holds that the figures listed before Narmer are theological constructs, divine rulers inserted to legitimize later royal authority. The tribute entries in the 3rd band are treated as ritual offerings made to deified ancestors. Ceremonial language. No transactional referent. That interpretation requires ignoring the administrative grammar of the document itself. The Palermo Stone is not a hymn. It is an annal. Its structure is identical to the verified historical registers it continues into. Reign year, flood height, significant event, quantity. Same column format. Same determinative conventions. Same verb tenses used for cattle counts and grain deliveries. There is no grammatical break between the sections Egyptology calls mythological and the sections it calls historical. The scribes did not shift register. The scholars did. The tribute entries in PSR3C7 through PSR3C14 follow the annal format without deviation. Each entry records a quantity, a material designation, and a recipient marker. The material designations include refined copper, cut cedar, and ground ochre. These are not symbolic offerings. These are physical commodities with quarry and trade designations attached. The recipient marker is the compound glyph, flagged as anomalous in the Schaeffer Index. A seated figure with a vertical extension marker paired with the directional glyph for south beyond the boundary. Not the south of Egypt, the region the Palermo scribes designated as beyond where the count applies. The quantities are not trivial. The copper entries alone, read against known Old Kingdom unit weights, represent approximately 4,000 kilograms of refined metal per recorded cycle. Not a hymn to a dead king. Not an offering to a localized deity. Not ceremonial language dressed in administrative format by a court scribe performing theater. A ledger, with quantities, with materials, with a recipient located outside the boundary of the Egyptian count of rulers. The Palermo scribes did not confuse mythology with administration. They had separate documents for each. The classification decision that buried this register as mythological preamble was made in the early 20th century, repeated without re-examination, and has held for 120 years. What it requires ignoring is the grammar. What the grammar requires accepting is the ledger. The secondary documentation sits in the mortuary temple of Sahur at Abu Sir, North Wall, Western Chamber. Register sequence designated ABWN4 in the 1907 Borchardt survey of the Abu Sir temple complex. Held in the German Archaeological Institute Cairo archive under reference DAIC 1907/114. The register was photographed in full during the 1994 Abusir Project survey. Those photographs are archived. The register has not been published in translation in any publicly available Egyptological journal. It has been described twice, in specialist footnotes, as containing administrative content inconsistent with mortuary context. That is the full extent of the published engagement with it. The ABWN4 register opens with a formulaic dating phrase, placing the recorded events during the reign of a king identified only by an epithet. He who continued what was owed. The phrase continued what was owed uses a verb construction that appears in 3 other locations in Old Kingdom administrative texts. All 3 appear in debt and obligation records. All 3 describe an inherited financial commitment rather than a new one. Egypt did not initiate this tribute. Egypt inherited it. The second section of ABWN4 describes the recipients using 4 sequential descriptors. Read literally, in order, using the determinative conventions the Abusir scribes applied consistently across the temple complex. The descriptors translate as follows: those of greater measure, those who came before the boundary stone was placed, those who do not require the flood to count their years, those to whom the copper and cedar are owed until the sign is given. Each descriptor carries a non-mythological determinative. Greater measure uses the architectural scale marker, the same one used in monument dimension records. Before the boundary stone uses the historical boundary marker, identical to its application in land survey documents. Do not require the flood. The flood count determinative is simply absent, and the absence is grammatically marked, not an oversight. Until the sign is given uses a contractual termination clause, the same construction found in lease agreements from the Old Kingdom administrative papyri at Gebelein. The third section records the delivery method. Goods were not sent to a temple. They were transported to a transfer point described as the place of exchange at the southern turn of the river. A geographic location, a waypoint, the same language used in trade expedition records, not sacred site dedications. The final section of ABWN4 records a question no mortuary temple register should contain. When does the obligation end? The answer, carved by the same hand in the same register, when those above the count send the sign of release. The Borchardt survey of 1907 cataloged ABWN4. The 1994 photographs exist in the DAIC archive. The register has been seen by credentialed scholars on 2 documented occasions since that survey, each resulting in a footnote acknowledging inconsistency with context, neither quoting the text in full. The institutional record did not lose ABWN4. It noted it, marked it difficult, and moved on. That's a different kind of erasure, not fire, not a chisel, a filing decision. The text remains on the wall at Abusir. The translation sits in a footnote. The footnote does not quote the translation. The translation has never appeared in full in a public document. In 2015, economist and complexity theorist Dr. Denise Schmont-Besserat co-authored a study published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies examining administrative continuity between pre-literate tribute systems and early dynastic record-keeping across the ancient Near East. Separately, in 2019, a team of economic historians at University College London, led by Dr. John Bennett, published a quantitative analysis in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology, examining redistributive tribute flows in pre-state Nile Valley societies, specifically the period 3500 to 3100 BCE. The Bennett study identified recurring commodity patterns in pre-dynastic exchange records that did not align with intra-Egyptian redistribution models. The commodities identified were refined copper, cedar, and processed ochre. They were moving in one direction. There was no documented return flow that balanced the ledger. In standard economic modeling, that pattern has one explanation: tribute, obligation-based transfer to an external recipient with the authority to compel it. The Bennett paper states this carefully in its third section. The pre-dynastic commodity record shows outbound flows of high-value materials toward the southern trade corridor that cannot be accounted for by any known Egyptian administrative center receiving those goods. The ABW N4 register at Abusir describes exactly this pattern: refined copper, cut cedar, ground ochre, outbound, to a transfer point at the southern river turn, on an inherited schedule, until a termination signal arrives from the recipients. The commodity archaeology matches the literal text, not approximately, specifically. The same materials, the same directional signature, the same absence of a return ledger. The second convergence is geographic. In 2021, remote sensing archaeologist Dr. Stefania Merlo at the British Institute in Eastern Africa published preliminary findings from satellite-based survey work in the Upper Nile corridor, specifically the region corresponding to the ancient Egyptian designation south beyond the boundary. The survey identified a series of large-scale earthwork formations at depths consistent with pre-3000 BCE construction activity. The geometric regularity of the largest formation, a roughly rectangular enclosure measuring approximately 340 meters on its long axis, is inconsistent with natural terrace formation in the substrate geology of that region. It reads the way a constructed enclosure reads in satellite return, not the way an erosion feature reads. The inscription says the transfer point was real and geographic. The satellite survey found a large constructed enclosure at the location the inscription's directional language indicates. Dr. Merlo filed for ground survey access in 2022 through the relevant National Antiquities Authority. The application was acknowledged. A supplementary documentation request was issued in 2023. The supplementary documentation was submitted in full. As of the date of this recording, no permit decision has been issued. The satellite imagery exists. The enclosure is in it. The inscription pointed there 4,600 years ago. The permit remains pending. No timeline has been provided. The first suppression is internal to Egypt and datable. Around 1350 BCE, during the restoration period following Akhenaten's reign, the priesthood of Amun conducted a systematic review of temple administrative archives that extended well beyond the erasure of Akhenaten's cartouche. Internal temple records from Karnak, specifically the archival inventory designated KANV-22 in the Chicago Oriental Institute's Epigraphic Survey records, include a category of texts described as the obligations of the old time. These texts were reclassified during the Horemheb administration from active administrative record to restricted priestly archive. The reclassification removed them from the governing record without destroying the physical documents. The tribute records were not burned. They were reclassified. The obligation ledgers became temple secrets. The outbound commodity flows in the Egyptian archaeological records stop at precisely the same administrative generation in which those records were reclassified. The tribute stopped. The records describing the tribute were sealed. Both events are datable to the same administrative period. That is not coincidence in the historical record. That is coordinated policy. The second suppression runs through 1822 and the foundational decipherment work of Jean-François Champollion. His personal correspondence, held at the Collège de France archive in Paris under the Champollion family donation, includes 3 letters from his 1828 Egyptian expedition describing pre-dynastic administrative texts he encountered at Abusir. In the second letter, dated October 1828, he describes a register in a Western temple chamber recording what he calls obligations antérieures, prior obligations, and notes that the recipient designation matches nothing in his working glossary of Egyptian deities or kings. He does not include this register in his published expedition account. The published account of the Abusir visit describes the mortuary reliefs in considered detail. The Western Chamber Register does not appear. The letter exists in the Collège de France archive. The published omission exists in the printed record. Between the two is a decision Champollion made and did not explain. The letters are accessible to credentialed researchers. They have not been published in collected form. The relevant passage has been quoted in one footnote in a 1987 French-language Egyptology monograph. That monograph was not translated into English. The third suppression is institutional and current. The Abusir Temple Complex is managed jointly by the Czech Institute of Egyptology at Charles University Prague, which has held the primary excavation concession since 1960, and the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. The Czech Institute's published output across 60 years of work at Abusir is substantial. The Western Chamber of the Sahur Mortuary Temple, the location of ABWN4, is documented in their survey records. The register appears in photographic archives. No full translation has been published in any Czech Institute monograph or journal series. A researcher who submitted a formal inquiry to the Czech Institute's Abusir project in 2018, requesting access to the photographic archive for ABWN4, received a response confirming the photographs exist and are held in Prague. The response stated that access for independent researchers requires a collaborative research agreement. The agreement process was initiated. Correspondence continued through 2020. It stopped. No agreement was concluded. No explanation was given. The photographs are in Prague. The register is on the wall at Abusir. The inquiry process opened. The inquiry process closed. Now let me be clear. I am not saying the pre-dynastic tribute recipients were a non-human species. I am not saying ancient Egypt was governed by an extraterrestrial authority compelling resource extraction from a subordinate civilization. I am not saying the commodity flows prove a hidden empire operating from the Upper Nile with political dominion over the early pharaohs. What I am saying is what the documents say. The Palermo stone records outbound tribute in annal format administrative language to recipients designated as existing outside the human king count. Across a period the stone itself treats as verified history. The ABW-N4 register at Abusir records an inherited obligation in copper, cedar, and ochre, delivered to a geographic transfer point on a schedule that terminates only when an external signal is received from the recipients. The commodity archaeology published in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology in 2019 confirms the outbound material flow. The satellite survey identified a constructed enclosure at the geographic coordinates the inscription's directional language indicates. And at a specific, datable administrative moment under the Horemheb restoration, the tribute stops. The records are reclassified from government archive to priestly secret, and no Egyptian source from that point forward acknowledges that any obligation ever existed. The Palermo stone is in 3 museums. The third band is on the fragment. The Schaefer Index is cited in academic literature going back 120 years. The ABW-N4 register is on a wall at Abusir, photographed in 1994, archived in Prague, absent from the published record. Champollion saw it in October of 1828 and chose not to say what he saw. The Czech Institute has the photographs. The satellite enclosure is in the imagery. The permit is pending. Egypt paid something. The ledger says so in the same administrative grammar it used to count cattle and measure the flood. Then Egypt stopped paying, reclassified the records, and spent the next 3,000 years saying nothing about it at all. The stone doesn't stop. The permit does.